by popular demand, and the fact that almost all Berserker technique guides are pretty out of date, and the fact that still no one cares about us BT gorillas even though we are on the precipice of surpassing mayhem and firmly planting ourselves in A tier, I, Genghis Khan, have taken it on myself to do this little bit of everything guide, so listen up. But before we dive into any of that, there is an issue that is uniquely a Berserker technique issue and isn't really talked about. This issue pops up to varying degrees in all the builds, and identifying it might help some of y'all decide which build works for you best. I call this issue the 0 hour. 0 hour is a period of time during the very end of your Berserk mode. At that moment, most Berserker technique players will burn majority of their cooldowns to maximize the damage during Berserk mode. While it seems optimal, there is an issue that arises from doing this. A lot of Berserker's main damage skills are also part of their meter generation rotation. So when Berserker technique players burn all their damage skills at the end of Berserk mode, they will exit the mode with majority of their meter generating skills on cooldown. This adds an extra layer of delay to re-entering Berserk mode on top of their already long animations. Depending on your specs, gems, runes, elixirs, and most of all, boss attack patterns, this delay can last as low as 7 seconds or as long as 15. Longer if you whiff or miss one of your meter generation skills. I call this delay the 0 hour because even though it lasts only for a few seconds, it feels like an hour, and it feels like you're doing 0 damage. The 0 hour is no big deal as it is the core of how your class damage is balanced, but in certain low-level homework content, it does become an issue. You basically get stuck in what I like to call the 0 hour loop. What happens when tackling low-level content is that the damage output is so high that the boss phases really fast. You might get a chance to activate Berserk mode and do just one rotation before the boss phases into a mech or into a damage reduction state. By the time the boss exits the state or phase, you will find yourself in the 0 hour situation again. That is, either you burn your cooldowns to maximize the damage in Berserk mode, or hold on to certain skills so that you can re-enter it faster. Either decision means a pretty big drop in your DPS, and regardless of what decision you make, you will get only one rotation in before the boss phases again, thereby trapping you in a constant loop. Nowhere is this issue more apparent than the current Gate 3 of Belshazzar, where the cube is constantly phasing into damage reduction mode. Again, it's not that big of a deal, but I feel people need to know this before they invest too much time and money into a class only to find this one weird quirk that turns them off. Anyway, real quick before we get into the meat of the guide, the 2 meter build rotations are as follows. There's the standard 6 skill meter build rotation right here. For it to work, you definitely need 2 purple wealth rune. If you don't, or lack 1650 plus spec, then you can either switch the third tripod on Windblade to Squall, or get focus on Tempest Slash. And here is the 4 skill meter build. The 2 ways to make it work is either to switch Windblade to Squall with the legendary wealth rune, or you can use the legendary wealth rune on Tempest Slash and switch to focus on the first tripod and Storm Slash on the third one. I prefer the second setup because I like to use Windblade as a movement skill in certain situations. Now on to the reason y'all are here for, the builds. There are 2 main builds and a third that is getting very popular, but I will have to talk about it separately. The 2 main builds are a Salvation build with 3 Bloody Rushes per activation, and the Halucination build with 4 Bloody Rushes per activation. You take the same skills and tripod for all 3 builds, with the only variation coming in the first row of Finish Strike tripod, where you pick whether you want it to be faster or slower but harder hitting. And in the Windblade and Tempest Slash tripods, depending on what kind of meter build rotation you are going for, or whether you have all the wealth runes and spec to get a full meter build in one rotation. As for Elixir, you go with Critical for Hallucination and Master for Salvation, because Salvation does suffer from some crit issues. The main damage rotation for all builds is Red Dust, Finish Strike, Overdrive, Bloody Rush, Hellblade. Bloody Rush and Hellblade can be flipped for better skill syncing, but I find that leaving Bloody Rush for the end usually results in the boss moving, which results in you spending time chasing down the boss, which results in some parts of the Bloody Rush landing outside of the Red Dust window. Of all your skills, Bloody Rush should have the highest priority of landing within the red dust window. If you run Entropy, then Hellblade and Overdrive positions can be switched, since Overdrive doesn't benefit from Entropy set, and so it doesn't matter if it lands outside of the red dust window. First up, the Salvation build. This build has been the king for the longest time, but with the recent changes, its grip on the crown has been shaky. For stats, you go full spec with crit. You want to be around 600 to 650 crit. There are some people who prefer a swift spec bracelet to add some mobility and speed. They run around 500 crit and 100 or more swift, and rest in spec. But I would advise against this unless you have a buddy who can always bring crit synergy whenever you play your Zerker. For 5x3 in Grey Games, you run Berserker Technique, Keen Blunt, Mass Increase, Raid Captain, and Grudge. For +1, your options are Ether Predator, Curse Doll, or Adrenaline. For +2, Curse Doll works the best, but some people prefer Adrenaline. Ether Predator works better at +1 than it does at +2. At +2, it only gives 1% more damage than Curse Doll, and only after it reaches max stacks. Keep in mind that if you run Adrenaline, you will have to substitute Brave Flash with Assault Blade to help maintain the Adrenaline stacks. You run damage and cooldown gems on all your main heavy hitters. That is your Finish Strike, Overdrive, Hellblade, and Bloody Rush, with damage gem only for Tempest Slash and Brave Flash, and the last slot goes for a cooldown gem on Red Dust. This build allows you to run Mass Increase, which gives you more attack power than Cursed Doll, with the added benefit that Salvation bonus negates the attack speed debuff from Mass Increase. This build also gives you the biggest numbers you will get with an absolutely monstrous Berserker Fury Awakening. Another great thing about this build is that it works really well at level 7 cooldown gems, so you can delay transitioning to level 9s or 10s. There are two really big issues with running Salvation. The first is that it is very hard to get all your Red Dust to sync with your Bloody Rushes. Red Dust is your biggest damage and crit steroid, but the cooldowns simply don't line up well with the 3 Bloody Rushes you get per activation. Holding on to your skills so you can force the sync can often result in you getting only 2 Bloody Rushes per activation. So the optimal way to use it is to use your Red Dust on 2 Bloody Rushes and use Mountain Crash Crit Steroid on the third. The rotation works out where the first Bloody Rush will sync with the first Red Dust rotation, the second will sync with Mountain Crash, and the third Bloody Rush will sync with Red Dust again. Level 9 and level 10 cooldown gems slightly improves this situation, but the window is still very tight. Plus, those gems are super expensive, and not everyone has access to that kind of cash. The other thing is that it feels absolutely miserable outside of Berserk mode. You will experience the longest instances of 0 hour in this build, and because you are running Mass Increase and your abilities have some of the slowest animations in the game, getting back into Berserk mode can be challenging at times, especially with some of the more jumpier bosses. Crit is also a problem for Salvation build, especially if you don't consistently play with other crit synergy classes. None of this means the build is bad, it is the highest DPS build you can make in Trixion. And unfortunately, Trixion damage is not real damage, because if it was, Igniter Sword would be top tier. Still, it gives you a good idea about its potential. You will get the biggest numbers with Salvation, and by God, that awakening damage is so sexy. Now for the Hallucination build. You absolutely need 600 plus swiftness, and 1750 plus spec, and a minimum of level 9 gems. Anything less, and the window to get the 4th Bloody Rush within the Berserk timer is too small. So small that if you take the time to scratch your nose, you will miss the window. For 5x3, you take Berserker Technique, Grudge, Keen Blunt, Curse Doll, and Raid Captain. For +1 and +2, you take Ether Predator. Adrenaline is not recommended here as crit is not that bad of an issue for Hallucination as it is for Salvation. The gems here are the same as they are in the Salvation build. This build is the most expensive build you can make for the BT Zerker. There are hard stat and gear requirements for it to work, but it is the only build that matches Salvation in damage in Trixion. And because of the 650 swiftness, in my experience, I felt like I was doing more damage in real fights than Salvation. The swiftness made it so that I didn't feel like I was moving underwater when my Berserk mode ended, and it ensured I always had cooldowns whenever an opening presented itself. The extra cooldown reduction from swiftness also significantly reduced the length of 0 hours you will experience throughout the fight. You can also sync 3 of the 4 bloody rushes with red dust, although the rotation requirements are very strict. To do so, your first bloody rush, upon activation, needs to be the first move you do after red dust. This will desync your skills for the next red dust rotation, so you will have to hold for a few seconds, but it will sync the next bloody rush to the end of this rotation. The third bloody rush will simply not sync up with anything, and you will have to use the crit steroid from Mountain Crash as soon as the cooldown is up. If you do everything correctly, it will give you a very small window at the end where you can use red dust and instantly go into the final bloody rush. This results in an absolute gigaton of damage, but the problem is that if you make a mistake anywhere, or most importantly, if the boss knocks you down or does one of the many millions of unfavorable patterns, you will not get the fourth bloody rush. In fact, because of how random the boss patterns are, it is impossible to get 4 bloody rushes in every single activation. I found myself getting 4 bloody rushes in less than 50% of my activations. It is that hard. Because of this really tight timing for everything, I found playing this build is sorta stressful. The build has a very high skill ceiling and rewards skilled players, but the randomness of the bosses makes that ceiling difficult to achieve consistently. Even still, I felt like I was outperforming the Salvation build in real fights, but that might be just because my playstyle works better with a little bit of swiftness. So which one of the two do I prefer? I was jumping in between this build and the Salvation build for a while until Voltis dropped. On Gate 2 of Voltis, I brought my Salvation build and smacked the boss with all 5 of my awakenings. You know, the awakenings that are supposed to do a gigaton of damage in Salvation build. The reason why you take Salvation build, those awakenings, not a single one of those motherfuckers crit. That, along with the issue of walking around like a one-legged goblin outside of Berserk mode, made me switch to Hallucination. It just wasn't for me, but if you're a big fan of big numbers, then Salvation is the way for you. And finally, the Entropy build. I want to talk about this separately because I don't know if I'm going to do a guide for it. There are a few reasons. The first and foremost is our favorite currency of them all, Fions. Yes, I can recreate the build in Trixion, but again, and it bears repeating because some of y'all simply refuse to understand that Trixion damage is not real damage. So whatever I do in Trixion does not matter. Therefore, I don't want to do a guide on a build I haven't tested in a real raid. Also, and this is the biggest reason of them all, Entropy is still on the chopping block. Since I last checked, Smilegate still intends to remove Entropy from the game, or at the very least alter it. So I don't want to do a guide that inspires people to spend an enormous amount of time and money into a build that might not even exist down the road. If despite this you still want me to do an Entropy build guide, then let me know in the comment section below. As far as I know, right now there are multiple variations of Entropy, so I can do a whole video on it. So let me know if you are interested and I will create one. Until then, peace.